And let's begin with Premier Smith moving ahead with a controversial trip to Florida despite renewed calls to cancel.
You're using taxpayer money to raise funds for a right-wing extremist organization in the U.S. when you've already asked Americans to interfere in the federal election.
I expect the Premier, as an Albertan, to be everywhere at any time that she gets a chance to sell this province.
That's an important message for Americans to hear about the impacts that potential tariffs would have.
Danielle Smith is set to share the stage with right-wing podcaster Ben Shapiro at a fundraiser Thursday for pro-America organization PragerU, a trip that comes as the Premier faces backlash for recent comments made to Breitbart claiming the tariff war was hurting the federal Conservatives' election chances. Kathy, the Smith government has made much of sending cabinet ministers, MLAs, south of the border to engage with elected representatives in soft diplomacy on the tariffs front. How do you see this PragerU fundraiser fitting into that equation?
I don't think it has a very good fit at all. I think for the average person, they would say that if you're going to be a marquee speaker at a fundraiser for a private organization, that your views are in some way aligned with that organization. And so I think this may have slipped over the line of what the average person would think is actually a legitimate thing to do on the public purse in terms of influencing politicians.
Najib, how do you see perceptions playing around this Florida event in the wake of all the controversy this week over what was said in that Breitbart interview?
Listen, I'm a fan of going on long-form podcasts for politicians during electioneering, et cetera. I'm sure we'll see it in this federal election as well. But sometimes long-form hurts politicians when they don't have a sound strategy. And this is definitely one of those cases. It's bewildering to me that anyone would think this is a good idea. There's no votes in Shapiro's audience. This is a guy who's called for the annexation of Canada as a non-voting state, similar to Puerto Rico. It's just ridiculous to think that he or any of his audience is going to be aligned with any of the anti-U.S. sentiment right now that's happening in Canada and the concerns around tariffs. It just seems like a silly self-promotion that doesn't really benefit Alberta or Canada in any way.
Kathy, were she to cancel, back out of this U.S. event, and that does not seem to be the case, but if she were to have done that, what kind of political risk might that potentially carry back here at home?
Well, if she backs out, I suppose that the part of her base that's ultra conservative would say that she had been pushed to do so by the woke media or whatever, the horrifying leftists of the NDP, and that she should have stuck to her guns. But what kind of a small sliver of the overall constituency of Alberta is that? It might be part of her base, but there's another load of people that have been involved in voting for her over the years. I think it actually might do her some good if she was willing to say, okay, I've rethought this, and I think maybe this is a step too far, or even if she wants to not admit she was wrong, she could say, it's being so misconstrued that I think I should change my plans.
Najib, could this carry long-term ramifications, or is this just a blip on the radar? It's soon forgotten.
No, I mean, it definitely will have ramifications, as we saw with the Breitbart interview as well. Canadians are paying close attention to our politicians and what they're doing in south of the border. And it definitely hurts the federal Conservatives, as we've seen already. I mean, you just have to look at the polling to see that, the most important thing on Canadians' minds is, and I'm sure Nick will reinforce this later on, is the concerns around tariffs and U.S.-Canada relations. So it's a terrible time to be doing any sort of this kind of positioning and this kind of messaging. I think, and it's not, you don't even have to make up a story. You could just say, or schedule some interviews with governors, which is who she should be meeting with, and just say that it's a conflict and that I have other meetings scheduled. And so it's not something that you can't easily get out of and do it smartly and do it where people think that Albertans think, oh, that makes sense. This is much more important and a much better focus than going on a podcast with this personality.
All right. Next up, a longtime NDP MLA has resigned his Edmonton seat to run now for the federal Liberals. Rod Loyola was first elected in 2015, won his third term 2 years ago. According to the Speaker's office, the resignation took effect Tuesday. Today, nomination notice went out identifying Loyola as the Liberal candidate for Edmonton Gateway. His resignation as an MLA will require a by-election, putting 2 such votes now on the radar, with the existing vacancy in Edmonton Strathcona, where Najib Jutt intends to run for a seat. Najib, how surprised are you to see an Alberta NDP MLA quitting his seat to run for the federal Liberals?
Well, it's about as surprised as I am seeing people who said they weren't going to run, Liberals who said they weren't going to run again, but now that the fortunes are changing, or decided to run again. So, I'm a fan of term limits, even if they're self-imposed. Rod's done now 2.5 terms, and I don't begrudge him for wanting to move on and do something different, it's still running as a Liberal in Alberta is a risk, so it's not a guarantee for him either way, but he has decided to pursue something else and let a new, fresh voice come into the provincial riding that he represented for 2.5 terms, and I don't begrudge him that, and I think that he'll have a battle ahead of him to try to win that Liberal seat. I mean, I've seen polling which says that Liberals could win up to 5 seats in Alberta. So, you never know.
Kathy, Najib Jutt put out a one-line statement Tuesday thanking Loyola for his many years of service, wishing him luck in his future endeavors. What's your read on where this leaves the opposition?
I don't think it does them a huge amount of damage. I mean, realistically, they have a pretty good lock on Edmonton, and so I don't see Rod Loyola jumping ship as causing an enormous amount of damage for them. He hasn't been a particularly sort of front bench critic for them. Certainly in this session, I've been watching a bit of QP, and he hasn't been the loudest voice by any stretch of the imagination. So I think they'll be okay. If he had jumped to the federal Conservatives, of course, it would have been a whole different kettle of fish, because you go like, how could that possibly happen, and what's going on in the Alberta NDP? But there's not quite as big a gap going to the federal side.
We heard from pollster Nick Nanos off the top of the program tonight on the latest polls and how the federal election is shaping up. Kathy, how challenged do you feel Mark Carney and the Liberals will be to sustain the substantial rebound they're currently enjoying in the polls?
I think they will be quite challenged for a couple of reasons. There's a couple of big variables here that certainly aren't completely in their control. One of the biggest, obviously, is Donald Trump. What's going to happen on April 2nd when we get to yet another tariff deadline? If he suddenly completely backs off on tariffs, that is going to take away some of the interest in the Liberal Party, simply because right now I think a lot of the bounce that the Liberals are getting is that Mark Carney is perceived to be a better person to negotiate with Trump. If there's nothing to negotiate, then some of that goes away. Another issue, and this is within their control, but there's a certain amount of bounce you get from being a new leader. He really needs to keep that impetus going, and he needs to not make mistakes. We know from Alberta politics, when you take a look at a situation like the last Jim Prentice election, where he made a few chance remarks that made him look entitled or arrogant. That's something that Carney really has to watch for, and he's already had a couple of rough goes with media where he's just been a little too supercilious in his answers. He really needs to watch that, because right now he's against Pierre Poilievre, who is not really doing that well in the polls in terms of a trajectory upwards in terms of likability. Most of the polls show he's just bumping along at the same level. And since he's had a lot of exposure in the last week, you would think that would start to go up. We'll have to keep an eye on that too.
Well, Najib, on the point of Pierre Poilievre, what do you feel it will take for the Conservatives to sway support back into their corner, retake the lead that they enjoyed for well over a year?
Well, I think it's interesting that they haven't yet come up with a strategy to take on Prime Minister Carney. This sloganeering and Trump style, different slogans, et cetera, that's just not going to work with all the anti-Trump sentiment. I agree with Kathy that, in an election, any gaffe can be significant. And already the Conservatives are painting Carney as an elitist. So any remarks or casual remarks that he might make to reinforce that, it could put him in some trouble. But, as far as I can see right now, the Liberal Party is doing all the right things and saying all the right things. This is the first election in a long time, where we're going back to old school politics, where we're talking about jobs and economy and taxes. Like when was the last time that happened, and we weren't talking about silly things like, divisive things like that we have in the past. And we're talking about actually substantial things that Canadians care about. So, and I don't know if the tariff conversation changes that. I think Canadians have been given a little shake, and realize that we've been too complacent in our relationship with the U.S. and too reliant on it. And I think that whichever party is able to capture how we get away from that sort of reliance and that dependence on the U.S. I think whichever party can show that they're moving towards getting away from that, I think is going to continue to see significant support.
Kathy, how much of a turning point might the two official debates on April 16th and 17th end up being?
We know that Mr. Carney particularly has had some issues with his French, and one wonders if he's probably sitting in somewhere in the evenings with headphones on, trying to sharpen up his ability with French. Already, the Conservatives have tried to make a big deal out of him not wanting to go on TVA for that televised French debate that was going to be an add-on. That's where he has got some issues. How great that will be is a question mark. I don't know if there is an appetite right now in Quebec to vote Conservative. There may not be. So that may not have that much of an effect.
Najib, what do you make of the prospect of battlegrounds emerging here in Alberta, especially where some of the urban ridings are concerned in Calgary and Edmonton?
Well, I think it's really interesting. I've seen some polling showing that the Liberals could pick up, up to 5 seats in Alberta, which is interesting. Considering where they were in 2019, and Alberta always seen as a conservative stronghold. But I think again, it's an election based on Carney and his messaging and the federal party's messaging and breaking through to Albertans. I think the fact that he's from Alberta and has made campaign and probably will make more campaign stops here, I think is going to help a lot. The quality of candidates here, I think it makes a huge difference to carry that message locally. And I know that the Liberal Party is actively courting high-profile names all over the country, not just in Alberta, as part of their strategy to win more seats. And I think that makes all the difference in the world. But again, I think this is a federal level conversation, and a federal level strategy needs to go through into all the provinces, because at the end of the day, the concerns that Canadians have, like tariffs and other things, are more of a national conversation.
Kathy, how much effort do you see the front-running parties putting into our province?
Well, I have to say, up until now, it's been a little bit of lip service. Simply, already we don't have nominees for the Liberals here in Edmonton in some ridings, which this is some potential for them to pick up some seats, and yet they're still messing around, moving people from constituency to constituency. This is work that should have been done by now if they were serious, I think. I don't think they write off Alberta, but I don't think it really gets their major attention. Here in Edmonton, particularly, I think with Randy Boissonneau backing out and them starting to shuffle somebody else into Edmonton Centre, they might well lose that constituency, not to the Conservatives in this case, but quite likely to the NDP. In the South, at least, they have gotten themselves a couple of candidates who have name recognition. The mayor, Amarjeet Sohi, and Rod Loyola, we just spoke of. I think the question is whether you can get along with just some name recognition as opposed to the real hard work on the doorstep. And so far, we haven't been seeing that.
All right. We're out of time. Have to leave it there. Good to see you both. Thank you kindly.
Thank you.
Thank you, Michael.